نجدد الترحيب بكم مرة أخرى. والآن بننتظر 5 دقائق. اعذرونا. موجودة ليش؟ ضيوفنا الكرام، أيها الحضور الكريم، نجدد الترحيب بكم مرة أخرى. والآن نعود إليكم في أولى الجلسات النقاشية للمنتدى العربي الثالث بعنوان المنافسة والسياسة الاقتصادية. وستكون هذه الجلسة تحت إدارة الأستاذ طارق العلمي رئيس مجموعة الحوكمة ومنع النزاعات في لجنة الإسكواء. كما سيشاركه في هذه الجلسة المنافسة في منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية فرنسا الدكتور ظافر بن عوض الشنفري، النائب السابق لرئيس مجلس الإدارة والقائم بأعمال الرئيس التنفيذي لمركز حماية المنافسة ومنع الاحتكار سابقاً بسلطنة عمان، السيد حامد بن سلطان البوسعيدي، المدير التنفيذي لمركز عمان للحوكمة والاستدامة بسلطنة عمان. وعن طريق الزوم سيشاركنا معالي بتول عباس علام عوض وزيرة الصناعة بالسودان، مستر ماري كولمان نائبة الرئيس التنفيذية للشركة من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، مداخلة أيضا افتراضية. وأيضا سيشاركنا أبل ماتيوس أستاذ في الاقتصاد في جامعة نوفا البرتغال، أيضا مداخلة افتراضية. شكرا، فليتفضلوا مشكورين.
شكرا. صباح الخير جميعا. احنا الجلسة الأولى اليوم راح تكون عن المنافسة والسياسة الاقتصادية. طبعا للي بحب يجيب للترجمة، لأنه راح يكون بعض المداخلات باللغة الإنجليزية. And for those who would like to get for translation equipment, some of the interventions will be in Arabic also. For the third year in a row, we convene in the Arab Competition Forum to discuss the latest national and regional developments in the field of competition law and its enforcement. We will be discussing the most pressing issues and topics in competition, particularly at this period of time where the world and particularly the Arab region have been hit by multiple crises which brought to the forefront the same issues that were discussed in the region, including, of course, economic volatility, economic diversification, declining productivity, and thus exposing the importance of designing comprehensive policies which will take into account also the different sectors as well as aspects of the economy. And this is mainly the goal of today's session, where we will try to shed light on the association and the interlinkages between competition policy on the one hand and other economic and development policies on the other hand. Also, in addition to that, we will have, of course, with us specific issues that will be discussed from our region, where we will be discussing the policy environment as well as promoting competition in the Arab region. We will be, of course, benefiting from our distinguished panelists, who I would like to thank on behalf of all of us for taking the time to be with us this morning here in the beautiful country of Oman, or from also joining us online. Our session is going to be around 90 minutes. We will have two sessions. The first session, which will focus on policies. We will give each panelist 5 to 6 minutes, and then we will have a round of Q's and A's. And then the second session will focus on the institutional setup or the policy infrastructure that is needed, of course, to go ahead and promote competition policies. So if you have any question, please do not hesitate to raise your hand, or those who are following us through Zoom, please do put your question. My colleagues and I will try to read your question and address it to our distinguished panelists. Let me start with the first question with our Professor Frederick Jenny, the chairman of OECD Competition Committee. Professor Jenny, can you please shed light and explain the link between competition law enforcement, competition policy, and economic development?
Thank you very much for your question, and welcome to everybody. I just want to start by saying that we should all be aware of the fact that competition is a very tough discipline on the competitors, forces them to have lower prices, forces them to innovate, forces them to pass on to consumers the benefits of the cost saving. And therefore, there is a natural tendency on the part of firms to try to avoid this competition, to try to restrict it by cartelizing, monopolizing, creating barriers to entry, predating in some cases, to eliminate competitors, or at least to neutralize the competition with them. And this is the reason why we need to have vibrant competition authorities to try to prevent those practices from developing. Now, the message I have for you today is, unfortunately, slides don't seem to be up. It's a slide that I used, in fact, during the very first forum that we held 3 years ago, in 2019, at a time when ESCWA approached UNCTAD and OECD to try to create a partnership so that one could support the development of competition in this region. And at the time, it was a very confidential meeting, and I'm very happy to see how many people today are part of this, because it means that this effort to try to promote competition and to develop interest has in fact been fruitful, and I certainly hope that it can continue, and we will certainly, as OECD, be very happy to help. So on this first meeting, I showed this slide, and I want to start from this slide again, because we were talking about the general relationship between competition law enforcement and what I would call complementary policies, which are strictly necessary. And my purpose today is to say, how relevant is this to the MENA region? Okay. So you see that there's competition law, and there are links to various other policies: privatization, competitive neutrality, deregulation, promotion of a competition culture, elimination of corruption, and trade liberalization, among others. So I'm going to go through those very rapidly. I'm only going to use these slides. I have a deck of slides, but I guess it will be given to everybody later on. So let me start with regulatory reform. One of the reasons why competition law enforcement is not sufficient to promote competition and to help development is that there are many other sources of lack of competition besides the behavior of firms. One of them is regulation. It may be national regulation, it may be local regulation that prevents competitors very often from being able to compete with an incumbent, with an established firm. And we have in mind many of those regulations. Now, is that relevant to the MENA region? I would say yes, and I would base myself on an analysis by Rabah Reski from the World Bank, who is the chief economist for the World Bank for this region, who says, and I'm going to quote him, "The economics of MENA have favored incumbent firms, whether private or state-owned. The wall of vested interest in MENA countries must be torn down. In practice, this could translate in the creation of regulatory watchdogs to champion open competition." And this is one of the functions of competition authority, which is not competition law enforcement, which is to go after, to look, to suggest changes in regulations to make them less anti-competitive. Let me turn to a second topic which was on the slide, which is the relationship between competition and corruption. Now, the world over, we do have a problem of corruption, and corruption, of course, distorts competition, because the result of corruption is the fact that whoever gets the advantage, whoever gets the contract from government, is not necessarily the most efficient firm, but it is the firm that benefited from the use of corruption. Now, this is very high on the agenda in many countries, and in particular, I must say, in the MENA region. We know that in Iraq, for example, recently, Al-Rasafa Criminal Court sentenced the former Undersecretary of the Ministry of Energy to 6 years in jail. Or we know also that the Libyan Minister of Culture, following the Minister of Education, was arrested also for having awarded contracts in a corrupt fashion. Now, what's interesting about those examples is that they are based on the fact that public procurement were given without competition through a corrupt practice. So it brings the link between corruption, lack of competition. So the fight against corruption is crucial if we really want to have competition. Now, Saudi Arabia, for example, is very aware of this. King Salman Abdulaziz, for example, in 2015, made a statement that his government would have zero tolerance for corruption, and that he and members of the royal family were not above the law. Okay. Now, the question is whether those efforts to stamp out corruption are strong enough to allow competition to develop. I think that much remains to be done in the MENA region, as in many other regions, and the World Bank in particular has pointed out the fact that there is not only an economic dimension, a dimension of competition, but also a political dimension to the elimination of corruption. I don't have to go, don't have time to go much into details, but maybe we can talk about it later on. Let me turn to state-owned enterprises and competitive neutrality. The IMF has written on this, about the role and the importance and the characteristics of state-owned enterprises in the MENA region, and has noted that not only are state-owned enterprises in many sectors, including sectors where one would think that private initiative would be sufficient, and I've got two examples in mind. One of them has to do with carpet making, and the other one has to do with tobacco manufacturing, not sectors where there is clearly a market failure. But the IMF also notes that state-owned enterprises that hold dominant or monopolistic positions in selected sectors are very often exempt from competition law altogether in some countries. Algeria would be an example. But second, that state-owned enterprises are treated very often differently through specific legislation, and one of the points is bankruptcy, for example. In general, they cannot fear bankruptcy, no matter how badly managed they are. 2 minutes, okay. But they are treated differently, and there's also the idea that state-owned enterprises are very often treated differently by the courts, and that it's very difficult to enforce the court decision against state-owned enterprises. Now, all this is, of course, doesn't help competition, is directly antagonistic to competition, and this is why having a policy of competitive neutrality, treating state-owned enterprises the same way that their private competitors are treated is particularly important. I've got only two items on my list, and I've got 2 minutes. So one of them is the relationship between trade liberalization and competition, which is on top of the slide here. The MENA OECD Working Group on Investment and Trade has a background note which was established by the Secretary, and which points to the fact that there are many barriers to growth in trade and investment in the MENA region. First, it's a region which is relatively, has a low level of economic integration. Average tariffs, even though they've decreased, they are still pretty high. Trade facilitation is not very developed. There's little integration of the regional economy because of weak institutions, lack of infrastructure, and cumbersome licensing procedures. Now, all this means what? It means that the intensity of foreign competition, or sometimes the domestic competition, if we're talking about foreign direct investment, is not as strong as it would be if there was a more open, a more liberal, and a more definite trade policy. So trade policy helps also the development of competition. Let me finish with one thing, which is the promotion of a competition culture, which is also very important in order to make competition work. Competition works only to the extent that the buyers make competition work between the suppliers. So everybody has to understand what the benefit of competition is for competition to actually exist. Now, in many countries, the local culture may be not very, may not easily accept the idea that competition leads to a better organization and more economic development. If I take the MENA country, for example, in many of the country, wasita is a social practice whereby people rely on a connection to get what they want from government, whether it's a contract or whether it's a job. Okay. Now, I'm not discussing the fact that these may have advantages, particularly in countries that have a very weak governmental structure. But what it does is that it means that the people who get the contracts or the people who get the jobs are not necessarily the better or the best qualified for the job or the country. The competition authority must have a role in convincing people who who have been traditionally behaving differently, that there may be merits, there may be benefits from competition. And this is a very tough job, but strictly necessary. So my conclusion is simple. In all countries in the world, competition law enforcement cannot be a standalone policy. It needs complementary policies. Second, is it relevant to the MENA region? For the reasons which I've just mentioned, I think that this is indeed relevant for the region. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Jenny, and I hope that we will have time in the second session to go a bit deeper into these interlinkages. للأسف لقد وردني أنه المعالي الوزيرة بتول علام عوض لم تستطع أنه تشبك معنا through الزوم، وبالتالي سوف ننتقل إلى المتحدث الثالث اليوم، دكتور ماري كولمان. Dr. Coleman, can you hear us? Dr. Coleman?
Can you hear me?
Great. Good morning. Well, Dr. Coleman is the Vice President of Compass Lexecon. Her consulting practices specialize in the comparative analysis of mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures and antitrust litigation, including class action certification issues. Previously, Dr. Coleman was the Deputy Director of Antitrust in the Bureau of Economics of the Federal Trade Commission. Dr. Coleman, in your opinion, how can competition contribute to the effective enforcement of different policy agendas? The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. So I think that, competition can contribute to the effective enforcement of various policy agendas, and the background note that was included with this session, I think, describes many of these very well. As Professor Jenny had mentioned originally, competition, as he said, is tough on competitors, but it's good for consumers because it leads to lower prices. It leads to products being produced more efficiently, and it makes for more incentives for improvements in goods and services, and that's good for consumers of those goods and services and for businesses. Also, a well-developed competition policy can provide incentives, as Professor Jenny was discussing, for investments by firms, both domestic and foreign, in existing and new businesses to sort of challenge the existing incumbent firms and put pressure on those firms to themselves compete, as well as providing additional options for consumers. And with a good competition policy and the other concurrent policies, these incentives for investments are greater because they will understand that smaller firms will have an opportunity to compete, and if they offer competitive goods and services, they have a good chance of succeeding and profiting. And this is particularly important in countries such as in the MENA region, where there has been state control of many industries or significant concentration of ownership. And so without a strong competition policy, there may be concerns about new firms that they wouldn't be able to compete with incumbents, or there'd be favoritism towards them. And investments by these firms can contribute to economic growth, increased employment, and broader opportunities for a wider group of citizens potentially. I think one thing to keep in mind when implementing and enforcing competition policy, while it's certainly important to encourage new entry and not to protect incumbent firms that are in strong positions or allow them to behave in ways that would significantly undermine the ability of other firms to grow or enter, it's also important not to punish firms who have become successful. So if a firm creates a good or a service that is very popular and grows into a strong position, you should be able to profit from that. That's the whole fact that drives incentives to innovate and invest after all. So the goal of competition policy is not necessarily be atomistic competition where you always have lots of small firms that may not be most efficient and may not work particularly in smaller countries such as in the MENA region. But you want to have an environment, as Professor Jerry was saying, a sort of competition culture. You want a culture that encourages competition, that encourages entry and growth, and discourages or prevents anti-competitive behavior, but also allows efficient, innovative, or productive firms to benefit. And that's, that takes a balance, because eventually if a firm does do very well and gets a strong position, then you might have to worry about, well, will they have incentives to then maintain that position in ways that aren't efficient, aren't offering good products at low prices, but are actually trying to block competitors. And so, but on the other hand, you don't want a firm that does do that by offering good products at low prices. You don't want to all of a sudden start making it the subject of a lot of investigations or regulations. And so there's a balance there. And really, what I would say the important factor to have is to make sure that you have a policy that encourages entry, competition, and firms to compete on the merits, and discourages protection of existing incumbent positions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. We have another online participant, Dr. Abel Matthias. Dr. Matthias, can you hear us?
Yes, can you?
Good morning. We hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Greetings from Lisbon, and it's an honor for me to address this competition forum, Arab Competition Forum. I just wanted to say a couple of things related also with my own experience as the president of the competition authority in Portugal, the first one, and also my experience of being consultant around the world in some of these matters. First of all, let me say that an Arab barometer around several Arab countries, especially the Mediterranean countries, have concluded that there is the economic situation is presently one of the main worries of the populations, and we have several of these countries have experienced a low economic growth and productivity growth, and one of the anxieties of the youth in these countries is to emigrate, due especially among the educated youth, due to the lack of good jobs and opportunities in their own countries. So, I would say that to change this situation, competition policy is extremely important in order to further growth and in order to change opportunities. And let me also emphasize that building strong institutions is the core for the success of growth in this region. And one important institution is building an effective competition policy regime. It is not only important in per se the competition policy regime, but also the preconditions for building such a regime. Building an effective regime of competition requires, first of all, an effective and working state in a peaceful environment. Unfortunately, there are three countries in the region that have this serious problem and needs to be overcome. A market economy with low level of informality. There is a need of a market infrastructure. Markets function with physical infrastructure, with telecommunications, with good regulatory regimes and so on. And a trade policy is crucial, as a small country should have an open trade regime with low tariffs and quantitative restrictions, low barriers for firms to enter and to exit activities, effective regulation of natural monopolies in energy, telecom, water, and financial sector and insurance markets, and the rule of law, modern economic and judicial codes, lack of threat of expropriation, functioning court and independent judiciary, and effective policing of these policies. I have followed a lot of these studies that have tried to score the competition policy among many countries and compared with the world regions. And they, in general, score quite high, for instance, in terms of existing competition laws. Several of these countries have even independent authority national competition authorities and so on. But my experience and looking at the enforcement levels, there is a lot that needs to be done. And as you know, competition policy is much more than competition law. Barriers to competition flowing from government policy, including trade barriers, mandated monopolies, licensing regimes, and other regulatory barriers to entry and exit, are not usually addressed by competition law, but they are a precondition for the functioning of an effective market economy. When those barriers are pervasive, which is the case in many countries, competition laws and agencies will not be enough to unleash a competitive and a productive economy. And the primary lever for governments is to address these policy barriers directly. As you know, for instance, I think there are two distinctive groups of countries among many countries. I think the Gulf states are much more advanced in terms of having competition laws, in general enacted for more than a decade. However, priority should be given to write a common competition law tailored to the institutional characteristics of these states. The EXO has already advised this common competition law for all these Gulf Cooperation Council states, and I think it's an extremely important policy to be advanced. These states are at a stage that they should create all national competition authorities, not part of ministries, but they should be independent. Competition law should apply to public policies the same way as it applies to private enterprises, and competition authorities should be given jurisdiction also to regulated sectors. Public procurement and concessions should be open to international bidding, except for security reasons, of course. and scrutinized for collusive practices. And large economic groups should be scrutinized for abuses of dominance and subject to merger control according to the competition law. As my previous colleagues have emphasized, it is extremely important that the level playing field between the state and, in particular, the public enterprises and state monopolies should be in the same level playing field as the private enterprises, and bringing down barriers to entry is crucial in order to further competition among Arab countries. Thank you. I'll further give you some more thoughts afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Mateus. We'll move to our last speaker in this session, Mr. Hamid Sultan Al-Busa, Executive Director of Oman Center for Governance and Sustainability.
Two more speakers.
للي وراه. طيب. Previously, Mr. Hamid was the Director General of Supporting Services at Capital Market Authority and was also with Muscat Securities Market. Mr. Hamid, given your experience in the field of corporate governance, can you shed light on the interlinkage based on your experience between corporate governance and a competitive business environment?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allow me please to answer in Arabic, as this is Arab forum. Well, most of the audience, in fact, all of them, I think, Arab native speaking. بالإجابة على السؤال، الحقيقة في علاقة بين الحوكمة وبين المنافسة، ومثل ما قالوا الآخرين المنافسة هي محرك رئيسي للنمو والابتكار والإنتاجية، وهذه هي أهدافها، وحماية المستهلك وخلق شفافية في السوق. كذلك الحوكمة أهدافها تأتي على نطاق ماكرو ومايكرو، وفي ربط في هذا مع أهداف المنافسة، بحيث أن الحوكمة تساعد على النمو، على نمو الاقتصاد، تعزيز الاستثمارات، وعلى المايكرو ليفل تحسن من أداء المؤسسات الصغيرة بحيث تكون، أو الشركات، بحيث أنها تكون قادرة على المنافسة من الخارج ومن الداخل كذلك. أنا حتى لا أطيل سأتحدث عن نتائج أو تبعات المنافسة على 4 مجالات. أول شيء البرودكتيفيتي اللي هو الإنتاجية، وعلى الاستثمار، وعلى التريد التجارة، والإمبلويمنت وهو التوظيف، وأيضا دور الكومبيتيشن أو المنافسة في الفقر وعدم المساواة بين الجنسين. إذا تكلمنا عن المنافسة والإنتاجية، طبعا المنافسة تتيح لمؤسسات يعني جيدة في أدائها للدخول إلى الأسواق، وبالتالي وتخرج مؤسسات غير فعالة غير جيدة من الأسواق. دخول شركات بفعالية جيدة يساعد في تحسين الإنتاجية. سواء كانت الإنتاجية في المبيعات، إنتاجية في الإنتاج، في كل هذا. هناك جانب آخر المنافسة تساعد في تحسين الإنتاجية، وهو الإدارة. تحسين لابد في كل هذه الشركات أن تكون لدينا إدارة جيدة ممكنة. في الجانب المقابل الآخر الحوكمة أو حوكمة الشركات تساعد في حقيقة الأمر في تحسين مستوى الإدارة على شقيه، مجلس الإدارة والإدارة التنفيذية. أحد المبادئ الستة التي أتت بها منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية هو مجلس الإدارة. مجلس الإدارة معني في المقام الأول بتنمية هذه الشركات، الحفاظ على حقوق المستثمرين وحقوق صغار المساهمين. في الجانب الآخر المنافسة أيضا القصد منها في الأول والأخير يعني حماية المستهلكين. فلو نلاحظ في ربط وترابط بين الأهداف من حوكمة الشركات ومن المنافسة. الأمر الآخر المنافسة تجعلك مبدع، لها علاقة بالابتكار. لابد من تحسين الإنتاجية والاستمرار، و يعني الإنتاجية البرودكشن الإنتاجية تتطلب المؤسسات أن تكون مبتكرة. في الجانب الآخر الحوكمة من خلال وضع أدوار ومسؤوليات مجلس الإدارة لزمت مجلس الإدارة بيكون مستعد لما يسمى الابتكار الهدام disruptive innovation. على مجلس الإدارة أن بالفعل أن يعي تماما ما هو الابتكارات أو التي قد تضر بمؤسسته بشركته، ويكون سباق لها، يكون مطور لها بحيث لا تتأثر هذه الشركة وتخرج عن السوق ويخسر المساهمين والمستثمرين وصغار المساهمين بالتحديد هذه الأعمال أو الثروات. النقطة الثانية المنافسة عادة تستقطب استثمارات investments. لما نحسن احنا من سياسة المنافسة سنستقطب مؤسسات من خارج البلد، لأن هناك في سياسات وقوانين واضحة شفافة. أنا لست هنا بالحديث عن المنافسة وتفاصيلها، وإنما بالحديث عن مدى ترابط الحوكمة بالمنافسة، لكن ارتأيت أن أتطرق إلى إيجابيات المنافسة في نقاط معينة، في عناصر معينة، وما دور الحوكمة في هذه العناصر. بالنسبة للإنفستمنت كلنا يعرف الحوكمة الجيدة في أي بلد، وخاصة ليست فقط حوكمة الشركات وإنما حوكمة الشركات بكافة أشكالها، الشركات الحكومية، الشركات العائلية، حتى حوكمة القطاع العام، واقصد فيه الوزارات والهيئات. إن كانت لدينا حوكمة جيدة في عمان تأكدوا تماما أننا سوف نستقطب استثمارات من خارج البلد ومن داخل البلد. الحوكمة الجيدة استقطاب الاستثمارات يعني الثقة في أسواقنا، والحوكمة تعزز من الثقة، الشفافية. الشفافية إحدى ركائز الحوكمة، المساءلة والمحاسبة والنزاهة والعدالة، وهذه ركائز من ركائز الحوكمة. الجانب الآخر نقطة أخرى حبيت أتكلم فيها وهي المنافسة والتوظيف. لما تدخل في السوق المؤسسات أو أنه يكون عندنا سياسات داخل البلد، سياسات منافسة جيدة عادلة، ستتيح لمؤسسات كثيرة أنها يعني تنمو وتستمر، وبالتالي ستوفر وظائف. بالجانب الآخر أنا كنت أقول دائما إن الحوكمة توفر وظائف، فسئلت في أحد المنتديات كيف توفر وظائف؟ من ممارسات وقواعد الحوكمة تتطلب أن تكون في بعض المؤسسات أقسام أو دوائر تعنى بالحوكمة الجيدة، وهذه لابد أن يكون على رأسها مختصين في الحوكمة. فعندنا مجال كبير أن نحن ننشئ جيل فاهم أو وظيفة معينة لها علاقة بما يسمى الجفرنس أوفيسر، يعني مسؤول عن الحوكمة. هذا من جانب. الجانب الآخر كونه إحدى مبادئ الحوكمة تتكلم عن الإدارة، مبادئ الحوكمة الست التي أتت بها منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية. فنحن الآن نفتقر إلى فيما يتعلق بتكوين مجلس الإدارة. تكوين مجلس الإدارة من عناصر أو الكاركترستكس، يعني شخصية مجلس الإدارة، أن يكون هناك أعضاء مستقلين. للأسف في عمان ليس عندنا العضو المستقل بالقدر الكافي، فممكن نخلق أو حتى نؤسس أعضاء مستقلين وظيفتهم فقط وجودهم في مجالس إدارات الشركات، لأن العضو المستقل يعني ليس بالأمر الهين، وإعداد عضو مستقل يأخذ وقت، وهذه أنا أعتبرها يعني شخصيا أعتبرها هي وظيفة حقيقة، لأنه فيها مسؤوليات وأدوار وفيها أيضا مكافآت جيدة. فيما يتعلق قيل إنه يعني المنافسة لها علاقة بالحد من الفقر والمساواة، وبالفعل لن ندخل أيضا في تفاصيلها. سياسات المنافسة الجيدة هي يعني توسع من يعني تحسن من المعيشة بالنسبة للمستهلك، لأنه يجد الأسعار من خلال المنافسة في متناول اليد. كذلك بالنسبة للحوكمة، الحوكمة هي أداة تنموية لا يختلف عليها اثنان. تطبيقها التطبيق الأمثل في حقيقة الأمر يتيح لنا أن تكون هناك في مساواة وفي عدالة في توزيع الثروة، في جهات معنية رقابية من خلال التشريعات والقوانين. خلصنا؟ آخر دقيقة؟ طيب، وأنا أخلص تقريبا. ممكن تعمل على أن تطبق هذه الحوكمة بالتطبيق الأمثل وتراقب، وبالتالي نحن الآن نحاول نخلق مساواة. وأيضا أحد المبادئ الرئيسية في مبادئ الOECD ذكرت أن هناك معاملة صغار المساهمين أو المستثمرين أساسي جدا، المعاملة العادلة لصغار المساهمين. بالنسبة للإيكواليتي أو حتى العنصرية، نحن الآن نطالب في مجالس الإدارات أن تكون هناك نساء. عدد النساء في مجالس الإدارات قليل للأسف، ولا بد أن تكون هناك نساء ممثلات في مجالس الإدارات ولو بحد يعني أقصى شخصين. وصلت يعني تقريبا حاولت على عجالة أن أربط العلاقة بين الحوكمة وبين المنافسة في بيئة العمل، وهذا لا شك فيه أن الاثنين يكملون بعض في خلق بيئة تنافسية جذابة شفافة واعدة. شكرا.
شكرا سيد حامد، شكرا جزيلا. احنا اتفقنا مع السيد ظافر أظن يكون للجزء الثاني من السيشن حيكون سؤال طويل وكبير، فراح تاخذ double the time. طيب، خلينا نفتح باب الأسئلة. إذا في هناك من أسئلة our panelists، لو سمحتوا إذا في بس حدا ياخذ الميكروفون، وإذا ممكن الشخص اللي حابب يسأل سؤال يعرف عن نفسه ولمين السؤال موجه.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جمال عبد الله محمد الهنائي، مدير عام التجارة والصناعة وطريق الاستثمار في محافظة ظفار. عندي سؤال، كيف لنا أن نجعل الشركات تخفض أسعارها في وجود ارتفاع عالمي في الضرائب بكافة أنواعها سواء في الشحن أو القيمة المضافة وغيرها؟ فكيف للتاجر أن لا يرفع الأسعار، وكيف للمستهلك أن يدفع أقل؟ شكرا لكم.
ماشي.
سؤالك، خلينا ناخذ سؤالين أو ثلاثة وبعدين منجاوب.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الدكتور راشد العجمي، رئيس مجلس إدارة جهاز حماية المنافسة في الكويت. أنا عندي حقيقة سؤالين، ما أدري إذا مسموح لي سؤالين ولا بس سؤال واحد. عندي سؤال للبروفيسور جيني وعندي سؤال للأخ حامد البوسعيدي. ببدأ بالأخ حامد. هل تعتقد في رأيك أن دولنا في المنطقة جاهزة لما يسمى باقتصاد المنافسة، أم كان المفروض أن يسبق هذا الاقتصاد أو هذا طرح هذا الاقتصاد أمور تمهيدية تمهد الحكومات وتمهد الأفراد والمؤسسات والشركات لمثل هذا الاقتصاد؟ كان يسبقها مثلا طرح الحوكمة، كان يسبقها مثلا طرح موضوع التخصيص البرايفتايزيشن، كان يسبقها مثلا نشر بروموت الاويرنس اوف كومبيتيشن، ومن ثم يعني نطبق اقتصاد المنافسه بشكل اسهل وايسر واسرع. فهل ترى ان المفروض كان يسبقها امور، او ان احنا نبدا بالمنافسه وبعدين ننظر في الامور الثانيه اللي المفروض انها تسهل المنافسه؟ عندي I have a question for Professor Jenny. I think one of the most important things in our region is how to promote a competition culture. For example, you mentioned privatization. One of the most scary, if I can say that, issue for people in the region is to give the private sector all the services, governmental services. People they think that private sector will raise prices, will put more taxes or more fees in the services. Thank you.
شكرا. سؤال سريع هون وبعدين آخر سؤال.
اسمي عبد العزيز الزوم، رئيس التنفيذي للهيئة العامة للمنافسة بالمملكة العربية السعودية. سؤالي في الحقيقة هو ما هو الوضع اللي يجب أن تقوم فيه هيئات المنافسة على مستوى دول العالم في ضوء التغيرات الجيوسياسية اللي نراها الآن في الحرب في أوكرانيا؟ الحرب في أوكرانيا في تقديري أنها غيرت معالم كثيرة كنا نؤمن بها في كتب النظرية في الاقتصاد. أعتقد أن العولمة الآن أصبحت مهددة، النمو على مستوى العالم أصبح مهدد، الأمور اللي كنا دائما نسعى إلى وضع الخطب عليها في هيئات المنافسة على أنها ستفيد الاقتصاد أصبحت أيضا مهددة. التغيرات في الخطاب السياسي اللي نراها الآن سواء في الدول الأوروبية أو في أمريكا أو في غيرها كلها أصبحت تشير إلى أنها أصبحت مهددة للاستثمارات، أصبحت توقف حركة التجارة الخارجية، العولمة أصبحت مهددة، الكفاءة بحد ذاتها أيضا أصبحت مهددة. هل هنالك يعني تغيرات في تصوركم في الموقف الذي يجب أن يتخذه مثلا هيئات المنافسة على مستوى العالم؟ هل سيكون هنالك تغير في الخطاب التنموي الاقتصادي اللي أصبح مهم جدا لنا في تحقيق النمو الاقتصادي المستدام؟ أحتاج أني أسمع صراحة ما هو الرأي في المرحلة القادمة.
شكرا. سؤال غاية في الأهمية. ناخذ آخر سؤال بس. تفضل.
طبعا فضل سويلح، مدير عام المنافسة ومنع الاحتكارات وحماية المستهلك بالجمهورية اليمنية. أنا طبعا استمعت إلى كثير من المداخلات وكلها تتكلم حول حماية المنافسة، فطبعا يهمنا هو أصلا حماية المستهلك. أين دور حماية المستهلك؟ نحن نقول أنا أحمي المنافسة، يعني أنه أنا في الأخير أنا ما أحميش المستهلك. نحن في الحقيقة أنا وجدت أنه في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا وجود عمل احتكاري كما قيل سابقا، وهذا صحيح لعدم وجود منافسة حقيقية بين القطاعات التجارية. أنا ما أقول أنه القطاع التجاري الخاص لا يمكن أن ينافس نفسه بنفسه، يجب أن يكون في قطاع آخر له قطاع عام، قطاع عام بس تحت رقابة الدولة، لا يعني قطاع عام أي قطاع عام تحت رقابة الدولة. إذن كيف أستطيع أن أضبط عملية المنافسة؟ إذن من خلال وجود قطاع عام، لأن القطاع الخاص ما يهم المستهلك. أنا أعطيكم كثير من الأمثلة. عندنا باليمن عندي 3 شركتين ألف وباء، منتج واحد ينتجون منتج واحد، إذا رفع السعر اليوم ب100 ريال أو $100، الثاني يرفع نفس السعر ب100 اللي رفعه، إذا خفض إذا يخفض نفس المقدار اللي رفعه. إذا لابد من وجود قطاع عام ينافس هذه القطاعات الأخرى. إذن نقول إنه لابد من تعديل القوانين، قانون المنافسة، لابد من تعديل قانون حماية المستهلك. أين دورنا نحن كمسؤولين عن هذا الجانب اللي يهمنا؟ حقوق المستهلك اللي الأمان والسلع الجودة وبأسعار أقل، هذا ما يوجد.
شكرا.
ما يوجد.
وصل السؤال. شكرا جزيلا. My colleagues Coleman and Abel, can you hear us? معلش خلينا بس نعطي فرصة للإجابة بالوقت الحالي لأنه عندنا جزء آخر كمان. مين بحب؟ تفضل.
بسم الله. السؤال اللي وجه لي احنا في دول الخليج حسب علمي قطعنا شوط كبير حقيقة فيما يتعلق بحوكمة الشركات، ولكن يعني عندنا مجال، لأنه القطاع العام له علاقة طبعا بسياسات المنافسة كما ذكروا المتحدثين في السابق، والدكتورة أولى ذكرت قالت المناقصات الحكومية وغيرها. وأنا دائما أقول احنا في القطاع العام يعني بعدنا ما قطعنا شوط كبير في الحوكمة، وأنا دائما أقول لابد مستوى الحوكمة في القطاع الخاص يكون بنفس مستوى الحوكمة في القطاع العام. لو واحد أقل من الثاني درجة يصير في خلل، عدم فهم، عدم اتساق. الأمر الآخر قطعنا شوط كبير أيضا في سياسات المنافسة. كل دول يمكن عندها هيئات وعندها قوانين، وما أعتقد أنه لابد نبدأ بمرحلة مثلا حوكمة الشركات وبعدين نبدأ في المرحلة الثانية. ممكن نبتدي بالتوازي، يعني بالتوازي نطور من ممارسات الحوكمة لدينا، وأيضا ننظر في سياسات المنافسة. الحوكمة يا جماعة علشان تعرفوا هي أداة متطورة ليست أداة ثابتة، يعني ممارسات اليوم قد لا تصلح لممارسات الغد، وتتكيف مع بيئة العمل. مثل ما ذكر معاليه أنه الأوضاع الآن حقيقة بالفعل لما نتكلم عن سياسة المنافسة فيها أمور كثيرة، فيها الهيمنة، فيها التركيز، فيها يعني القوة الشرائية، فيها أشياء كثيرة. الآن وضحت لنا الأمور، يعني هيمنة على اقتصاد معين أو قطاع معين من قبل دولة معينة أثرت على باقي دول العالم. وحقيقة أنا أشوف أنه الجواب لسؤالك أن نمشي بالتوازي مع كل التشريعات أو السياسات اللي تخدم بعضها بعض، لأنه سياسة يعني ممارسات أو سياسات الحوكمة مكملة لسياسات المنافسة. وفي حقيقة الأمر أنا أرى وجهة نظري الشخصية، الحوكمة هي داعمة لكل سياسة، سياسة المنافسة، سياسة الاقتصاد الحر، التجارة، أيا كان، فهي أداة داعمة، هي يعني القاعدة الأساسية اللي تنطلق منها السياسات الأخرى حقيقة الأمر. هذا الجواب.
Thank you very much for those very interesting question. I'm not sure we're going to have time to go into all the details that would be necessary to answer them. But let me touch upon a few points which have been raised. One question which was not addressed to me, but where I would like to say something, was whether the region was ready for competition or whether there should be a preparation first before adopting a competition law. I think that one of the, as I said, the role of competition authority is not only to enforce, but also to advocate for competition with government, try to change regulations, try to adopt a frame of mind that will allow people to understand what competition is all about. So I don't think that one should wait. As a matter of fact, I think that the creation of a competition law and a competition authority is one of the ways in which the issue of competition can be brought to the fore. Now, of course, as there's more and more acceptance of competition, it becomes easier to enforce and to go deeper. But I don't think that there should be preparation, because the preparation is never going to come unless the competition authority actually does it. The second question is whether there are major changes in the economic perspective which change the nature, I would say, of competition law. First of all, I do not think that the war between Russia and Ukraine is something which in itself is going to lead to major changes of perspective on competition. I think that what it shows is that globalization is really necessary. If I take the region, for example, where is the wheat going to come from? If India closes its border, if there is no exports from Ukraine, and okay, we've been living in a world where we assume that globalization existed and was for the good. We would still be better off tomorrow, once the conflict is over, when there's a resumption of the globalization. But there may be more attention paid to regional value chain rather than completely international value chain. Second, there's going to be a bit more of a focus on excessive pricing, because we've seen this with the COVID crisis as well, that prices can be inflated considerably, much to and that the consumers are victimized. And competition authorities may not have been focused. I mean, they were more focused on barriers to entry, a bit less focused on pricing. So resilience, on the one hand, of economic system, focus on pricing and distribution, that may change a little bit the perspective in competition, but not a whole lot. I mean, the basic principle, I think, that we benefit from exchanges and we benefit from competitive exchanges is pretty strong and will remain. The third one was, how does one promote a competition culture? I wish I had the answer to that question. It's long work. I would say that enforcement can be a way to convince people that there are benefits to be had from a more competitive system. This has been used in many countries that recently adopted a competition law. I can think of the bread case in South Africa. This was a great case. Everybody knows what bread is all about. Everybody consumes bread. And when you find a cartel among the bakers, everybody realized that they've been victimized by this. There is an equivalent case in Latin America, in Peru, which was a chicken case. Everybody ate chicken, so everybody could relate to this. So it's not so useful to start with steel mills, because nobody knows what steel is, but it is very useful to start with things that matter for people.
Thank you.
Just a small intervention, just to defend His Excellency Dr. Abdelaziz's point on the geopolitics and the impact. I think with Frederick's point, I'd add, I expect with my modest experience there will be some impact on competition policymakers and lobbyists who believe in competition. I think there will be more discourse and belief on the other side, the non-believers or those who are not willing to really push the envelope in terms of enforcing more anti-monopoly practices. The reason is I think the security threat is always used when it comes to basic goods and services, when it comes to industries in the defense sector, where there will be hesitation, I expect, in regions in the Arab world to privatize more or even open up more competition whenever there is a potential of loss of supply chain of basic goods and services. So I think this discussion will happen. I don't think it's healthy for competition units whenever there's a major geopolitical issue that results in supply chain issues. But then again, this will always happen, and this will need to really be a discussion among the governments, within the governments, and when I have a chance to elaborate more later. Thank you.
Thank you. I see the master of the ceremony عم تطلع علي, so it seems to be that في changes, I guess. Please, قولي لنا.
خلاص عشان ننهي الجلسة.
أنهي ولا بدك تنهي الجلسة ولا مفروض؟
ننهي الجلسة خلاص.
طيب.
كيف؟
على الأقل مداخلة بسيطة.
لا خلص يعني أنا لأنه أنا مفروض يكون 90 دقيقة. هلا إحنا 57 دقيقة أخذنا بس. يعني خلص إحنا ننهي. أنا كنت لأني بدي أعطي بس السيد الشنفري بس 5 دقائق. ممنونك. شكرا. It seems to be that we are a bit behind schedule, not because of mismanagement from my side, but because of, I guess, the previous session took longer than expected. And apologies for those of you who also wanted to ask our esteemed colleagues and panelists other questions. Let me give the floor very quickly to Mr. Zafir Al-Shamfari. Please, given your experience, how do you see in the Omani case the understanding of economic policy makers on the importance of competition policy for economic welfare and economic development?
Sure. Thank you. استمحكم عذرا حتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. And just to balance with my colleague Hamid and the guests who are non-Arabic speakers. Generally, I think this is an excellent forum. It is timely. I think it's important to continue such forums because it's such a new area for the region. In terms of nations' ages, I think it is still very new. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of understanding competition. There's clearly a mix-up between consumer protection and competition protection. But from my modest experience, when we were setting up the Anti-Monopoly Center, and from, I have to confess, I've been a bit distanced from this area in the past year or two. I think just looking at simple facts, just to answer your question on the understanding of policymakers in Oman, economists, how do they link between competition law or enforcement and the economic growth or the other economic tools? I think there's a clear misalignment in some cases that I've seen firsthand. If you just look at the basic indicators in any global competitiveness report and look at the Arab nations, you'll see the majority of these nations are really not doing well when it comes to anti-monopoly enforcement or market dominance indicator ranking. And some are exceptions, but most of them are not in the middle or lower tiers. And that just gives you an idea that, it's just a small indicator, but gives you an idea what we're not doing maybe enough, or maybe we don't want to do enough more for various reasons. Another small indicator was mentioned in one of the presentations, is where you find the anti-monopoly center. So it's usually a small subset of a small department or a department within a ministry, and it gets diluted. It's not the major agenda item in that ministry. As opposed to having it as an independent body, it can be small, but can be at least empowered to be the champion. Again, I'd answer your question that I've seen that there's limited understanding compared to traditional policies, like obviously fiscal, monetary, investment laws, SME laws, and the rest are well established. They are priority in many cases. And competition may be a luxury or misunderstood by some policymakers. And the reasons are historical. If you look at it in the region, and mainly in the GCC region, we are new nations compared to, I mean, we have history. We're proud of our long history. But in terms of a modern economy and society, it's very new. And so what you'd find, as we evolved, there were new institutions, new laws. This was not a priority. You're still establishing the bricks of your house. And so competition was not the, and also our economies were very small. And so as we grew, the structure of our economies were based on mainly oil and gas in the region. So there were obviously already monopolies there. And you've had the other utility sectors that are mainly government owned. And then you had the retail sector where there was encouragement of more and more agencies. And so you had exclusive agencies, which was very normal practice. And so to come later, which is good that we've started, at least in the past 15 years or so, that we started this discussion, we should have a law, how can we enforce it, what shape, what organizations need to be shaped to run this program. And I think from my modest experience, I've seen policymakers who may still do a lot of lip service, talk about it, because it's a tick. And one of the funny things that happened when in 2018 I was asked to set up the competition center, I was looking at experts, world-renowned names, and so I met, I didn't know Frederick was there, so I would have probably met you. But I had arranged a meeting with Professor Richard Wish from King's College, who's a well-renowned competition law expert. And so the first thing he says when he sees me, I was an acting CEO, it was a new center, in a coffee shop, are you serious, or you just want to tick the box and have that competition center? So I obviously told him I wouldn't have been serious, I wouldn't have wasted your time or my time. And I think this is still there, to be realistic. And we have people who are genuine, who want to really change and improve. And I think the problem there that you will find that whoever is running the competition unit or in charge will face continuously the difficulty of making them, the other policymakers, aware of the link with economic growth. There's enough empirical data that proves and links job creation, governance improvement, anti-corruption with stronger enforcement of anti-monopoly and competition. And I think the resources will be an issue for those guys, getting the expertise. There was a mention of, are we ready, by my good friend, His Excellency Rashid Al-Ajmi. And I think that the ecosystem is not fully there. We need to work. So we don't have universities with expertise. We don't do enough research. We don't have, so the full ecosystem, not just government units and legislative side, needs to be in place. So just to wrap it up in a minute, I know I'm sorry I had to rush through this, but generally in our experience, the good thing is that we had in 2018, we didn't have the 2040 ready vision plan, but we had a program called Tanfeed, which was trying to pull things together in terms of what does Oman want to focus on. And there was a clarity in terms of having, setting up a competition center was actually a KPI for Tanfeed, and actually in empowering the center. And so we did have the linkage with the higher vision. We did have now a champion to work on this. It was a spin out from the Consumer Protection Authority, so there was some history. We had the law since 2011, but we did not really enforce it actively till 2018. And so with that experience, I think there was a lot of awareness. So what we did in terms of getting, some of the things I'm sure you are doing also, was to ensure we meet our key stakeholders, regulators. We signed a number of agreements, trying to avoid creating duplication, redundancy, make life difficult for the private sector, and lose the economic spirit, and get into an overkill of bureaucracy and lose our focus. This is something we tend to do. Obviously, the private sector, through the Chamber of Commerce, we did a lot of awareness campaigns, public, and it needs to continue, social media and others. So I'm cautious of the time, so I'll just end it with this point, is that I think the spirit needs to be, for new centers, flexibility, not to go into turf wars with other regulators, try to come up together with a cohesive economic tool as government, work with the other policymakers, so it kind of, the doses are in balance, and not we are, all of us are stretching the private sector, and instead of creating competition, we compete among ourselves and kill the competition in the private sector.
Thank you. شكرا جزيلا. أظن ضايل معنا 3 دقائق. So I think that we have 4 minutes, she was saying, and I will give each one of you one concluding remarks. 55 seconds, please, each.
55 seconds, okay.
Concluding remarks.
Let me just comment on the very interesting what we've heard recently. In 2 things. Indeed, well, first there has to be some political will to create competition. Let me quote just Farid Beaj from the World Bank Group stating this. Today the streets of Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and other countries, in those streets we hear demands from the youth asking for justice, governance, dignity, and jobs. In contrast, we see government unwilling or unable to move towards systems of governance, transparency, accountability, and competition for all. So it's a technical question, but it's also a political question. Second, how does one get started? The ecosystem that you were talking about, and I very much agree with you that there's got to be an ecosystem. Creating a competition authority, and I'm answering the gentleman from Yemen here, is probably the fastest way and the most effective way to do it, because if you create an independent institution which can be trusted both by the business community and by the bureaucracy and the political elite to, on the one side, enforce fairly, on the other side, give advice on, and advocate for competition, then slowly but surely academia will get interested. You will have specialists that will be produced by your universities because it will have become something of note.
Thank you.
And the academics will react. So I think that creating an independent institution is the place to start.
Many thanks. سيد بوسعيدي تفضل.
كلمة الأخيرة إنه ما ذكروا الأخوة إنه هناك ضروري وجود يعني الأطراف الأخرى أن تشترك في إعداد سياسات المنافسة بوضوح. ضروري أن تكون هناك جهات رقابية فاعلة لإنفاذ القوانين. ضروري هناك يكون في ابتكار وتطوير. ضروري تكون هناك في مساءلة، محاسبة، شفافية، نزاهة. لو لاحظتوا كل هذه الأشياء اللي الآن تكلموا فيها الأخوة زملائي والآخرين هي ممارسات وركائز الحوكمة، وأنا متمسك جدا في هذا لأنه يعني من اختصاصي. فأرى وجود حوكمة فاعلة جيدة مطبق التطبيق الأمثل في بيئة العمل وفي بيئة المال والأعمال هي محفز، أنا أسميها كاتاليست للقطاعات الأخرى وللسياسات الأخرى. شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا.
باختصار يعني أعتقد أنه التواصل المستمر، أذكر مع الإخوة في جهاز حماية المنافسة الكويتي، الإخوة في مصر، الإخوة الأشقاء العرب، هذا مهم جدا لأنه الكل يتفاوت في خبرته والكل يتفاوت في إمكانياته، ولكن أعتقد ممكن نستفيد من بعض. ولكن أحيانا نقطة مهمة نغفل عنها أنه إحنا نميل أن الجلوس مع بعض، وهذا شيء صحي، ولكن من تجربتنا حقيقة أحيانا الاستفادة من الشرق والغرب اللي سبقونا مهم جدا to customize. فسنغافورة من الدول الرائدة في هذا المجال، وأيضا دول الاسكندنافية وبريطانيا. فكان محاولة على أنه نعم نتحدث نستفيد من بعض، ولكن نقيس على أفضل الممارسات في تفعيل المنافسة، وليس الجانب النظري من القوانين واللوائح، ولكن في ممارسة تطبيق القانون بروح القانون بشكل جيد. شكرا.
شكرا سيد ظافر، شكرا للجميع. And my apologies to my colleagues Mary Coleman and Abel Mateus. We do not have any time left. Apologies for everyone, and for those who sent us questions through Zoom link, we will try to address them in writing. Many thanks to our distinguished colleagues. And the floor is yours, Madam Master of the Ceremony. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. نشكركم جزيل الشكر والتقدير. نشكر كل من الدكتور السيد طارق العلمي رئيس مجموعة الحوكمة ومنع النزاعات بمنظمة الأسكوا. كما نشكر من شاركنا مستر فريدريك جيني، والذي كانت من بين توصياته وجود تأسيس مؤسسات حكومية. نشكر أيضا الدكتور ظافر بن عوض الشنفري النائب السابق لرئيس مجلس الإدارة والقائم بأعمال الرئيس التنفيذي لمركز حماية المنافسة ومنع الاحتكار سابقا، وطبعا توصيته بالاستفادة من أفضل الممارسات في الدول العربية. كما نشكر السيد حامد بن سلطان البوسعيدي المدير التنفيذي لمركز عمان للحوكمة والاستدامة سلطنة عمان، وأيضا من ضمن توصياته ضرورة وجود حوكمة فاعلة تضيف وتطبق أفضل قوانين المنافسة، لأنها تعتبر هي المحفز للقطاعات الاقتصادية. ونشكر أيضا مستر ماري كولمان نائبة الرئيس التنفيذية لشركة ليكونسون كامبس من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لمداخلتها الافتراضية. وأيضا نشكر أبل ماتيوس أستاذ في الاقتصاد في جامعة نوفا البرتغال أيضا لمداخلته عن طريق الزوم. شكرا لكم. الآن مع ختام الجلسة النقاشية الأولى والتي استعرضت أهم مستجدات المنافسة والسياسة الاقتصادية، اسمحوا لنا أن نتوقف في استراحة قصيرة لمدة 10 دقائق. أرجو من الجميع الالتزام بالوقت، لأن ينتظرنا جدول وجلسات حتى يمكننا الانتهاء من هذه الجلسات، جلستين متعلقات بممارسات سياسة المنافسة. أيضا في أخوة، كما أود أن أدعو اليوم الفترة المسائية عندنا إعلان جوائز تحدي المنافسة الطلابي، والذي سيكون من الساعة 7 إلى 8. أرجو من الجميع مدعو بالحضور الساعة 6:30 في مركز عمان للمؤتمرات في نفس القاعة لتتويج الفائزين الثلاثة على موضوع تحدي المنافسة ومنع الاحتكار. شكرا لكم. شكرا دكاترة. شكرا.